all the rest is not going to work if you don't have the right zoning in place.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Housing Insiders, the podcast for founders, builders, lenders, and regulators, and anyone who believes that everyone should be well housed. I'm Jonathan Lawless.
And I'm Jeremy Potter. On Housing Insiders, we're hosting the conversations you won't hear anywhere else about how to make housing more innovative and attainable.
And we are super proud again to partner with Built Rewards, who's helping bring these smart conversations to you. If you have an idea for a guest or a show, have interest in sponsoring an episode, email us at podcast@thehousinginsiders.com.
And if you like the show, please give us a review and spread the word, share it so that we can make more of these great podcast episodes for you.
All right. Well, today's episode is going to be amazing. I think it will be as impactful as a Bill Pulte tweet. How's that for a level of impact? It's because we have an amazing guest, somebody I met a few years, probably prior to the pandemic. I had a chance to listen to her speak, and we had a chance to talk at a conference. And it is Diana Lind. She's got a great resume, and I will say that, like, if you're ever in Philadelphia, you should look her up. She's doing amazing things in the city of Philadelphia. Actually, what I know her most for is her amazing Substack, the new Urban Order, which, again, if you're on Substack, I highly recommend. She's also written 2 books. Actually, Diana, I'm sorry, I haven't read your first book yet, but I've read your second book, Brave New Home, a couple of times now. In fact, I remember reading it when it first came out, and then in anticipation of talking to you today, I went back and reread it because I remember liking it so much. So anyway, that's Diana. We're super happy to have her here. Welcome to Housing Insiders, Diana.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
We're really excited to talk to you, Diana. The future of housing is something that, we cover a lot or try to cover, help people understand where we are now, what's next, and where we're going later. And so that's something that's been on the top of your mind for a long time, your books and your work, especially in cities. So I was just kind of curious, as housing now becomes more of a mainstream national topic, we were hoping to take just a step back and ask you what got you into the housing topic in the first place. What is it about housing that drew you in and got your work started?
It's actually interesting. I was thinking about this recently. I have been writing about housing in different forms for pretty much my whole career. So I started out originally as a writer for Architectural Record, which is not to be confused with Architectural Digest, which is a mainstream interior magazine. Architectural Record is like the leading trade architecture magazine. And as an architecture critic or reporter or writer, oftentimes I was really drawn to writing about the beautiful houses that and the sort of innovative houses that we would, pull together into an annual houses issue for the magazine. And then from there, ended up working for a publisher called Rizzoli, which puts out also, great architecture monographs. And Jonathan mentioned in the intro that I wrote a book called Brooklyn Modern, which was all about kind of a new crop of young architects in Brooklyn in the early 2000s who were taking advantage of the fact that the borough, like compared to where it is now, had been was relatively affordable as a place for young architects to experiment with housing. I think, those were sort of my early days of thinking about housing, and it became very apparent to me that, like, there was this conversation about these beautiful houses, and yet at the same time an affordable housing crisis that was happening, and that, I at the time that I started thinking about writing Brave New Home, the book that eventually was published in 2020. I mean, just in the early 2010s, that's really when this housing crisis kind of, I think, started to become a mainstream topic and became just so much more of an issue in not just in New York or in San Francisco or in Boston, but in cities like Philadelphia where I lived. And so I just remember in 2016, that year in Philadelphia, I think housing prices went up by 20% just in one year. And it was, and I will say that, like, housing prices have not gone up since 2016 in Philadelphia. Very affordable metro area if you're trying to find an affordable place to live. But that year, and so, and at the same time, there were cities like, say, Seattle, which was starting to think about this idea of creating a tax on employees as a way to fund affordable housing in the city. And I just really at that point felt like the conversation around housing solutions felt relatively small compared to certainly where we are now heading into 2026. Like a decade ago, it also felt like the solutions that were being looked at were increasingly ideas like, taxes to fund affordable housing that were just not going to cut it, right? If we needed to find housing for tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. So my kind of, interest in this, I think, has really kind of run the gamut, and I think was formed by various different kinds of like lived experiences and a bit of a change from initially looking at housing as kind of like an architectural question to really more a policy one.
It's amazing. I love that you've gotten to focus on this in your career, and I have to say with a little bit of envy that, like, I just, it's if I had more time in my life, I'd spend a lot more time thinking about this issue in particular, and in fact, I'm reading Jane Jacobs' Death and Life of Great American Cities, which is a sort of a classic, and, just finished Ed Glazer's The Triumph of the City, and, I mean, just a fascinating topic. Both of those books, by the way, are bestsellers in the New York Times bestseller list, which is just shows, like, the general interest in housing. Your book, Brave New Home, kind of starts with an anecdote about having your first kid, if I remember correctly, and that's sort of putting you on this path of kind of rethinking American housing. And you spend a lot of time, I wouldn't say criticizing, but sort of, look a little more critically at our choice of the single family home as the housing type we want, and, which is interesting to me because most people, when they have their first kid, are like, I can't wait to get to a single family home. And you instead were sort of thinking about alternative forms of housing. So anyway, I'd love to, maybe for our listeners, give a little bit of why you are looking skeptically at the single family home, but also I'm just kind of curious now that your kids have grown, like, have you felt the call of the suburbs and sort of has that changed your thinking at all?
The anecdote that I start with is about, being on maternity leave in a sort of pre-remote work era. And will say that I have like a sister-in-law who is kind of just wrapping up her maternity leave, and how different it is to now have that experience of not just you being alone in your home, but that so many other people are right now. Like many people are working remotely from their homes, and that just would totally change your experience of being around people. But back then, being on maternity leave with everyone else at work, and I was just sort of, at home alone. And I was thinking, how did people like raise kids by themselves in their homes? This is so lonely and boring. And I had spent my entire life kind of leading up to that point. I was, 34 at the time, really not spending that much time at home. Like home was a base that I would return to, but it wasn't a place that I spent a ton of time at. And I think what I realized at that point was like people did not live like this up until very recently. Like most of humanity still does not live like this, where people are raising their families in their homes by themselves, and especially women, young women, like, raising a kid by themselves. Like that was not how it was done for the majority of humanity. And so I really just became curious, like, how did we end up with this? How did we end up with people thinking, to your point, like that when I have a kid, that the best thing that I could possibly do is live in a single family home? Like that was definitely, we had moved into a larger home, still within Philadelphia and still in a very like walkable, good neighborhood and whatnot. But we had moved into a larger home in anticipation of having a family and whatnot, and just kind of thinking that this is like the priority for and the way to raise, a family and whatnot. And so I think I really wanted to explore like how did people just end up with this being thinking that this was the way to raise their families, and then went down this rabbit hole of history. And we can certainly talk about just really how American housing did evolve into single family homes from you know a much, multi-generational homes, duplexes where people would share, housing with family, boarding houses, mixed use residences, all of these various different housing types that were much more common how we got there. I will say, at this point, I look at examples that I have written about and have seen since writing the book where people are raising their kids in community with others, whether it's, in communal living or it's in these kind of live with friends kind of scenarios where you have almost like a friend compound of houses near each other. And that makes a ton of sense, I think, especially when your kids are young. And as my kids have gotten older, I think I have felt a little bit less like that I need that kind of sense of community as much as I did when, my kids were not talking, they were, babies, and I needed someone to talk to, or I needed someone to learn from, see how other people were raising their kids. I think, as they get older, there's a little bit less of that. I will say that it's flipped into a different kind of situation where I now have parents who are in their late 70s and who are have just issues with aging, right? And I feel like the fact that I don't live near my parents is increasingly a challenge where just yesterday my parents live in New York, I live in Philadelphia, my husband was in New York for the day, and I was like, "Can you just stop in and say hi to my dad?" and stuff like that. It was like, that kind of proximity to family has increasingly made me think, is there a way that I could, you know, get my parents closer to me or get me closer to them? So this kind of question of like, why are we living away so far from the people that we need to care for, or not living within some kind of community of care, I think is just sort of continues and it changes as you morph over, your life and your family's life.
I think it's one of the things that John and I love the most about what we do is the complexity of the cultural preferences, personal preferences, mixed in with the economic outcomes, the structures, and actually the economic development of the thing is all mixed up in a very complex and interwoven way. And so we've always advocated for alternatives simply because we believe people should have choices to navigate those difficult decisions kind of the way that you mentioned. Do you think just, getting a lot of the tone and the feeling of Brave New Home, you kind of mentioned like how much people would do something if they could. Can you talk a little bit about the balance of like if the structure was there, my preferences would follow versus I have these preferences, now someone should build a product for me. How do you see that happening and playing out in your research and in what you just mentioned?
I mean, I think one of the stunning statistics is how many people want to live in a walkable community, and yet in the US, only 2% of metro areas are actually walkable. So, like, that's a perfect example of the kind of preference that people have that is not actually getting built and is not, and that I think would automatically find a base for it. And I think you find that in many cases, whether it is new developments that are more walkable, let's say in a suburb where you're kind of creating a sense of mixed use retail. Like those are the ones where you have rentals that are, sold out or housing that is sold out. So I do think that there is sort of this issue of, if you build it, they will come for a lot of these kinds of housing types that are really quite scarce. I will say that, and particularly around ideas of walkability, mixed use kinds of neighborhoods, I will say that some of the more communal housing types that I have written about, whether that is co-living or multi-generational households, those I think are a little bit of a trickier thing to pull off, financially for companies, and to find the right mix of who's actually going to live in these kinds of places. So, I think that is a little bit less of a surefire situation. I think one of the interesting things is when I wrote the Brave New Home, it came out in 2020. It came out during the worst year of the pandemic, right? But I wrote it primarily in 2018 and 2019, which was really like the height of the co-living boom in the country, where there were many different co-living companies and they were all building thousands of units. And by now, like that whole industry has generally kind of imploded. And I think some of that isn't necessarily a case that like people aren't interested in this style of living, but that the financing for this kind of product has been, and the business model has been trickier. Brad Hargraves, who is probably best known for his thesis driven company now, ran this, co-living company Common for a long time. He's talked a lot about why that company, essentially had to fold, and just the business of having, someone who could tend to all of the kind of programming needs and all of the, infrastructure needs of just one building in a city versus, needing to spread that person's time across three different metro areas. Like, it just got very complex and challenging over time. I think that there's sort of this overall question of like there's demand for these alternatives to single family housing. Finding the right kind of business model, I think, continues to be a challenge for things that are outside of the mainstream. And I think certainly at a small scale, things like co-living projects, they certainly can work, but the kind of like large scale, this is going to be a national company with, tens of thousands of units, that may still be kind of a dream at this point.
Yeah. It was so fun rereading your book, partially because it kind of put my mindset back to your point 5 years ago when I first read the book, but more importantly, like in the 2018, 2019, where, you had the awesome thing at the National Building Museum that was showing all these really fascinating new forms that you mentioned in the book. But it was a little depressing because, like of the companies you mentioned in the book, from Common to Nesterly to, I mean, there are probably 10, 12, 15 companies you mentioned. And of them, I think maybe two or three are still operating today. Now, of course, we had the pandemic in the middle, but there's a story I've been telling myself, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on it, Dana. Like, the millennial generation, as we know, is huge. It's massive. And in some ways, it influences a lot of the way that we think about housing because their housing needs are the most pressing of all. And, when millennials are in their 30s and like really super focused on moving to urban areas where the high paying jobs are and the cool clubs or, bespoke little bars or whatever, like whatever it is, like that was the time for that. And that's when, like, that's, when I personally thought like co-living seems like co-living urban, but now that the millennial generation has gotten older and has kids, having kids, their needs have changed. And to your point, like the sort of challenges of like aging parents. So I wonder whether or not, I don't know, there's just something to be learned from that in the sense that like the biggest part of our population is really kind of driving how we think about housing. And that's constantly evolving as that generation changes. And so, kind of to Jeremy's need, like their needs are going to evolve. So, are we going to find the next best way to have your parents can live in the background and age in place and ADs? And then the next year is, oh, wait, you're getting old now. Like, you know what I mean? Like, are we just constantly trying to fix a problem that's like passing really quickly?
It's a really good point and interesting question. I mean, I tend to think, to your first part of your comment about the companies that have kind of fallen in the process, I think that's just sort of like natural. That's natural that some companies are going to start up, they're going to fail, they're going to evolve into something else. It kind of reminds me of like almost the restaurant industry. But then the ideas, the themes, like let's just say, like the idea of like a, farm to table restaurant, like your particular farm to table place may have closed, but the concept of farm to table lives on, and there are going to be different, new restaurants that are taking that concept forward. So I think that you we may end up seeing that. So it's particularly around when I think about some of the innovation in, say, accessory dwelling units, right? I mentioned one particular company which was focused on almost creating like a kit of parts that could be built into a two-car garage where you turn one part of the garage into an ADU in California. And that seemed to me like, honestly, a brilliant idea. The company didn't end up working, but you're going to see other kinds of kit of parts ADU operators like out there, just kind of learning from the ways in which other companies failed and trying something new. I think, to your point, like there's going to be a constant evolution of what these different housing types are, but also I think the big trend is the push for more housing types overall. So, like to your point of like, what are the new trendy housing types? Maybe it was co-living in the 2010s. In the 2020s, it could be the single stair building. And as, the whole conversation around how building code changes, what housing gets built, that's going to, just kind of spawn some new interest in different types of housing as a result. So that will kind of, just keep on changing. And it could have something to do with, the changes in the demographics that just, overall, like, the population is definitely aging. Like, demographics are destiny. Our population is aging. There are going to be fewer families overall. I think, not just the demographic changes, but the technological changes, how much people are going to be remote working and how that changes where people want to live. And then, lastly, I think there's some huge economic questions that are going to change, whether people are still investing in sending their kids to college in 15 years from now, if the kind of model of education changes back to even more of people having tutors and becoming apprentices. Like, I actually think that that may end up starting to happen increasingly as people, as frankly, sadly, our education system really, starts to break down, and also AI really changes what information you can trust, and what kinds of jobs people want to have. So I think all of that has the potential to change the housing types. It's really hard to predict what those housing types will be, but I think the sort of the overall trend would be towards more housing choice, more flexibility, and looking at how changes in zoning, building codes, releasing some of these restrictions opens up new housing options.
Yeah, one of the things that we like thinking about and focusing on here is what is changing and how this innovation is happening. So I want to flip it because I'm trying to be disciplined about asking the other question too, which is in your work, what is not changing? What hasn't changed? And I kind of want to zoom out for a second and ask you how far back we should look. Your research in Brave New Home took us back to a lot of the sort of American concepts of housing, especially in those East Coast cities in the early part of the century. I'm actually taking an even step back and trying to pull in some more of those co-living communal questions. And I'm thinking like, if communal and co-living was so true for people for so long in so many different cultures, and in our culture, it's still the beginning and the end. We talk about college as the best time of our lives. We then all plan for communal living. We save literally our whole lives to probably end up in communal living at the end. So are we just deceiving ourselves a bit that this American middle part is actually the way of the future in terms of housing? And we should actually be thinking more about communal and co-living as like in the scope of people? I'm curious your thoughts.
Well, one thing that I think is also starting to shift is that, just recently, housing homeownership started to decline for the first time in a decade. And as increasingly housing costs make it impossible for many people to be homeowners, I think that the sort of increase in focus in people spending their lives as renters will really kind of shift, I think, the ways in which people embrace other housing types. When I think about why people don't live in communal housing up to now, like for that middle chunk of their lives, their 30s, 40s, 50s, like, let's just say, I think a lot of it has to do with people needing to find some sort of financial security to build their families upon, and then to build wealth for their families, to have some sort of asset that they can, potentially pass down or leverage in some fashion, right? So as that potentially becomes less attainable for many people, I could see people starting to shift away from the single family home as part of that sort of overall trend, and potentially finding other strategies. So in my other life, I also work for a an organization called the Asset Funders Network, which works with philanthropies around the country to think about asset building, particularly for low and middle income households. And we're really looking at renter wealth building as one of the strategies that people are really interested in exploring. Like, how do you help renters save? How are there different strategies that renters can find to co-invest in where they're living? And so I think that as that sort of question of like, do people need to invest in the single family home as part of their sort of family financial strategy? As that, I think, shifts and as people see more other options out there, that could potentially change how people are thinking about like, why am I living in a single family home? I think, the truth. The one other thing I will just say is like, I have looked at things like I mentioned earlier, Live with Friends. It's a company that Phil Levin, who he was one of the co-founders of Cul-de-sac. He this his new company they started, Live with Friends, is all about helping people to find. Sorry, I think it's called Live Near Friends now, not Live with Friends. It was originally Live with Friends, now Live Near. And the idea being, especially on the West Coast, exploiting some of the new housing legislation that has enabled people to split up single family lots into, up to 10 units. How can people sort of build more of these kinds of compounds that they can live near their friends and all co-invest in it? It's like it's hard, I mean, I will say, like, I don't know how his business is doing. It's probably doing great. He's super smart, but I will say, like, I have thought about this idea for me and some of my friends. I've thought about this idea for me and my family. This kind of more communal living, it's hard. It's hard to get everyone on the same page. You really need people who are like-minded. And for some people, it will be great. But I think for a lot of folks, it's really challenging. So I think that those are some of the headwinds that I see. The communal living when you're in college, it's already set up for you. It's the way, you're assigned to a dorm your freshman year. For senior living, it is, something that a lot of people opt into. It's something that a lot of people don't opt into. It's, sort of their final destination, but it's already, really kind of set up for you for that sort of, bringing your family together into some kind of communal living situation. It's not set up. And so the lack of any kind of structure, people have to figure it out for themselves. I think it's pretty challenging.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I just wanna make one thing, John. Our friends from Frolic is
Yes.
a company, and
Mhm.
I like to think of the challenge that they have, which is similar to Live Near Friends, which is
Mhm.
it's really 3 or 4 companies in one. Because of the
Yeah.
complexity of what you're doing, you end up taking on the real estate, the development, the co-op, and the financing, and that includes the financing for the individual units. So it's just really complex.
Yeah, absolutely. We have to have Frolic on at some point because I love what they're doing in this space. This might be a little bit of a rambling question, Diana, but sort of when I look at conservatives and how they think about housing choice, one thing that constantly comes up is like, what is a family friendly housing policy? So, like, even make it more extreme. What's a pro-natalist housing policy look like? If we want more Americans to be able to have families, like I often joke, like if my wife and I had to live in a 600 square foot apartment, like with 2 kids, we'd probably be divorced pretty quickly, Just it's, like, hard to imagine having kids there, although, you often sort of think of the liberal progressive views sort of being more the sort of neo-urbanist, kinda like close living in cities. But to me, there's kind of a middle ground, and I guess my question is, like, I kind of agree with you that the sort of isolated single family home to me just seems miserable. And, there are parts of Maryland just north of me, like, where there's massive homes, but, like, it's like a football field between that house and the next house, and I'm like, God, that just seems so unbearably lonely, and it's not walkable, there's no community, there's nothing to do except stay in your home, versus sort of the neighborhood where I live, which are single family homes, but there's, like, 5 yards between each house, and there's alleys behind the house, and the kids are out there playing all the time. Anyway, that feels like kind of an interesting compromise, but to your point, the challenge of getting everybody on the same page there, you can kinda create these things, is a challenge of jobs, right? It's like, oftentimes you're compromising, like, if you want that experience, that means a 2-hour commute to the city, where you have to work. Trying to think about the things that could really break that, And one thing that you've mentioned a few times is this concept of remote working, which I've like very initially, even prior to the pandemic, I was sort of thinking, boy, wouldn't remote working kind of really change the dynamics of housing because you're no longer constrained to live in a certain spot because of your job, but you now have choices as to where to live. And I had so much optimism. I mean, the silver lining of the pandemic was like it was becoming common. And now we're kind of going back. But anyway, I'm kind of curious, is remote working something that can help us get to that ability to create these family friendly communities that don't have to be super urban? Or anyway.
I have come across a little bit of research on different trends that help support, larger families. Was a part of a conference where Lyman Stone, who is he's a researcher who focuses on these kinds of issues. He presented on how living close to your parents actually reduces how many children that you'll end up having. And country after country, like if you live with
Really?
your yeah, if you live with your
Huh.
parents, you're less likely to be having sex is basically what
Well,
this
okay. That thanks
the
for the
sort
clarification. That makes sense now.
that's basically what he's saying. And likewise, another researcher at the conference, and I'm blanking on her name, also in Lexington, she had talked about how multi-generational living was also really stressful for families. So I don't want to sugarcoat the idea that like all of this communal living is positive and necessarily makes for happier, bigger families, easier caregiving. I think that, the kind of question of why multi-generational living could be stressful is like, very hard to unpack. A lot of people live multi-generationally because they are for economic security, right? So that's a stressful situation to be in to begin with, and a lot of our housing is really not set up for multi-generational living with areas of privacy and separation even among family members. So I totally recognize like a lot of people will say some of these ideas around communal living like they aren't great for people raising families. To your question about like remote work and how that might end up enabling people to have larger families or start a family in the first place, maybe. I think the driving factor for most families is affordability. Like, being able to afford a home and to feel secure enough that you can start a family, I think is probably the most important aspect of it. And most of the people who are able to work entirely remotely are already the sort of they're the most affluent and educated people in the first place, right? So, like those people are probably gonna not have a problem starting a family, raising a family, having as many kids as they want to have, being able to afford it. I think the people who are not working remotely, who are working on site, are oftentimes the ones who are gonna be more challenged with the affordability. So, I think, there are advantages, probably all those advantages for remote work are probably going to accrue to people who are already advantaged. And that's fine. That's great. That may end up helping, more people. Those folks have, more family, more people in their family. But I would sort of say that if we're trying to figure out, how we can encourage people to have more children, certainly, I think figuring out how to create more affordable, stable housing and whether that in some cases ends up being, I think it really depends on the metro area, like how you do that. I will say, living in Philadelphia, having grown up in New York, and many of my friends are in New York, I have a lot of friends in Philadelphia who have 3 kids. That is like, I don't know anyone in New York who has 3 kids. I know many people who have 1 kid. I know some people who have 2 kids. And I would guess that a lot of that has to do with like the affordability of Philadelphia's housing, the ability to have the space to have 3 kids. So that I think is sort of the unlock, and I think that is why a lot of people, say, "Hey, we should be enabling sprawl if that enables more affordable housing for people." I think to me that my issues with sprawl have less to do with even the environmental concerns certainly there are those, but really about the amount of time that people end up then spending just driving places rather than actually spending time with family or, at their jobs or relaxing or having, quality leisure time. So, but I see why a lot of people, think like we should just do whatever it takes to build more affordable housing, no matter how far it is from the core of the city.
I was gonna take a quick break because we need to hear a quick word from our sponsor, and then Jeremy, you can bring us back afterwards. Built Rewards is a payment platform for housing that rewards members in their home and neighborhood. Built is the payment platform for over 5 million units because Built provides incredible value to residents and to property owners and managers that use it. Properties using Built have seen reduced turnover, increased usage of electronic payments, and fewer missed payments. And with our latest resident loyalty program, Built is changing the way that property managers can reward good behavior. Managers can assign rewards and benefits to tenants for a variety of activities like early lease renewal. If you're interested in learning more, go to alliance.builtrewards.com.
We're talking to Diana Lind, the author of Brave New Home and the program officer for Asset Funding Network, Funder Network, excuse me, Diana, in Philadelphia. And we were just talking about affordability and we were talking about the economic costs. And I'm curious, when I was growing up in central Pennsylvania as a kid, it was obvious to me that I would own a house. That's what my parents said. That's what they did. And for them, it was something that they were very proud of, but it was also a financial decision in the sense of investment. And now we're talking about two other things. The emotional choice that you're making around housing, because the financial decision is no longer an investment. It's a, can I even make it? Can I even make it in? And so I'm curious if that shift, you talked about home ownership going down. If in the 80s it was 75% an investment and 25% an emotional decision, I feel like it's flipped, if not more so, to be almost 90-10 an emotional decision because it doesn't work economically for a lot of people. Can you talk about both sides of affordability, getting in, but also is it still a good investment to get in? Like, why are we trying so hard to get in if it actually isn't playing out anymore?
Mm. Well, I think it depends on what point you entered the housing market. So, for anyone who's entering the housing market right now, I really have no idea what's going to happen in the next 10 years to your investment, right? Like, if you're just entering now and you're buying housing that is, potentially 50% more costly than it was in 2019, like, I just don't know that you are going to, at, a 6% or higher interest rate, like, I just don't know how the math will work for you in the long term. Probably still, if you're holding on to that house for 30 years, like, that's still probably gonna be a really good investment for you, but in the short run, sort of, like, remains to be seen. I understand entirely why in 2020 there was such a mad rush to buy housing and to relocate and to take advantage, especially among the remote work class, to take advantage of only having to go into the office a few times a week, and that unlocked a whole new geography for people, and it made perfect financial sense, I think, for them, and many of those folks have now seen their housing equity rise tremendously over the years. In terms of it being emotional versus a financial, I think, like, those two issues it's like almost impossible to separate at this point, because it's like if you were going into it purely as an investment opportunity, like, you could just buy a rental property and be entirely that you just see it as an investment. But if you're looking at it as a sort of extension, both an investment in yourself and in your family and in your whole story and narrative. I think that that's, a lot of what is still driving people to be homeowners these days, and why people do it. And I think it would be hard for people to I don't know if people have ever really kind of invested in housing without thinking that it was, in some part connected to them and to their family's future.
Mhm. Yeah, we recently talked to Kristen Messerly, who surveys a lot of millennials, and that was sort of thematic there. Is like it's such an there's an emotional part, but like they want to see the numbers to make partially to make sure they're not making a mistake. But like anyway, they are really interconnected in this interesting way, and I think that's a great point. I wanted to ask you, maybe you're working on a new book, maybe not, but if you are, and if you're thinking about it, I want to learn a lot about it, but I'm going to ask a very specific question about it, which is when you kind of scan the landscape of housing and sort of think about some of the models you talked about in Brave New Home, are there new models that you're really now more interested in, or is it the same models? Are there companies out there that are doing things that you're like this companies or cities or whatnot? So anyway, what's got you excited about housing? What changes are you optimistic about right now?
What is exciting to me right now is I feel like we're in a completely different landscape in terms of conversations about zoning and what we should enable in our cities. Just the fact that a lot of cities are getting much smarter about, whether it's not requiring as much parking, or allowing something other than just single family homes in their downtowns. Those kinds of like moves, that is, it's like pervasive now. And maybe it's just because I'm coming off of like, a week or so ago from being at YIMBY Town, but that was just all really pretty much a series of recaps of ways in which the YIMBY movement has won over the years. As far as, interesting companies and things that are, I should have like scanned my LinkedIn because I do feel like there's a lot that is happening out there, but I'm sort of coming up short in the immediate term. I think the larger trends that I am kind of trying to look at are like how are some of these different companies going to adapt to the, I would say, like, wobbly moment that we are in terms of housing right now, is the strategy going to be, like, where are the companies that are really trying to do innovative work in terms of renovating office into residential, for example? I think that the trend that I'm most interested in would be how different cities and developers are thinking about existing housing rather than building new housing, especially as like the cost of housing is pretty expensive, cost of building new is expensive, and inventory is kind of sitting out there for a little bit longer. I think the other trends that I'm really interested in is like the rise of the Northeast and Midwest and how these places that haven't up to now embraced as much some of the zoning reform are going to have to because there's more interest in that. And what happens to places like Texas and Florida? In Philadelphia, we just celebrated that I mean, it's not like a great thing to celebrate. We're no longer the
The poorest
the
city?
poorest large city in the country. We've passed on that sad mantle to Houston, and our poverty rate has gone down to below 20% for the first time in over 40 years. I think there's going to be a real change in landscape of like the story that we've been told for decades about the Sun Belt as being this affordable paradise. That I think is going to really start to shift over the coming decades. So those are some of the things that I'm kind of looking at. Yeah, I can talk a little bit more about book ideas too, but those are, as in terms of the different trends I'm watching, those are some of them.
You mentioned the Midwest, thinking about housing differently, thinking about urban development, but specifically housing development differently because Detroit has land and because a lot of these upper Midwest cities have land that other cities, especially in the Sun Belt, don't have. And so I'll frame the question this way. Based on the research you just mentioned, your work at Asset Funders Network, and what we're talking about, I'm seeing more philanthropy, cities, maybe corporate balance sheets, considering taking an equity position in the capital stack for housing development. I'm curious what your reaction would be to thinking about cities instead of doing tax credits, partnering with corporates and philanthropy and actually building a new type of equity stack with residents in that sort of renter wealth builder model. We're thinking about a lot here in Detroit. I'm curious what would be your reaction to the city as an equity partner instead of a resources distribution network?
I think that's a really fascinating idea. And certainly, I have heard more of family offices trying to take a role in building affordable housing where they're trying to take kind of like a almost like minimal level of return that will work for their investment, and that enabling affordable housing developers to work with outside of having to use, low income housing tax credits, and some of the kinds of ways in which philanthropy is starting to partner on, particularly like around affordable housing, so that you don't have to necessarily rely upon government support. I think that's really interesting. I've also, been really interested to see places like, say, Atlanta, where the city is using city owned property, converting that into housing. I think that's a really interesting trend. I haven't seen as much of, cities necessarily coming in as, equity partners, but the increasing interest in cities using land leases as a way of them, maintaining their stake in the development of the community, like, and not just giving away land as an asset. That has also been another big trend.
Yeah, and I think, Montgomery County actually is an area that's been doing some investments like that pretty successfully, and I happen to be talking to the city of Chattanooga recently, and I think they're contemplating doing a similar thing. So yeah, I'm glad Jeremy mentioned that because I think it's kind of an interesting play. One of the things that you recently posted on Substack that I thought was really interesting, I'd love to get your take on it because you mentioned Yimby Town, which I wasn't able to go to this year, but I was really wanting to go, and as well as the Abundance meeting, which had a lot of a similar sort of crowd there. But your Substack post mentioned something along the lines of like, what happens if Yimbys win and we get zoning changed, but it's the broader economic challenges of building that become the constraint. And interestingly, like, so I work with the Casita Coalition. They've done a great job of advocating for ADU reform, and lots of places have adopted that. But then once that zoning change happens, and we did see a great pickup in California, but it's sort of running into a wall because the financing is terrible and the construction is actually more expensive than people think. And it's just all of these things get complicated. And I haven't spent a lot of time studying what's happened in Minneapolis since they've sort of zoned, undone all of single family zoning, allowed for multiple things. So, but I suspect it's probably not resulted in as many homes as we want. So, anyway, you study this more than I do. Has zoning been successful, or has zoning been the first problem we need to solve? And we've got a lot of really big, hard problems to solve after.
I think it's a little bit of the last thing that you said. After I posted that, I got a lot of responses about how zoning is a precondition, and I kind of agree with that, right? Like, all the rest is not going to work if you don't have the right zoning in place. So that is like important and shouldn't be ignored. But it is also like not going to solve everything. So if you think of, let's just say somebody who has like, whatever kind of chronic disease, like, it's important that they eat well and they rest and they walk, but that also is not enough necessarily to like
Hmm.
bring
Hmm.
that person back to health, right? So, but it's all they're not gonna get healthy probably if they don't do those other things either. I think that just, to say accessory dwelling units, I've written a lot about ADUs over the years, and I think that's sort of like a great example of how simply just enabling them, like, you have to figure out what is the problem you're trying to solve, and is this the right tool for it? And what is the right tool, and how do you be strategic about it? Simply just enabling accessory dwelling units and saying that this enables affordability isn't necessarily going to actually create a whole new raft of affordable housing. Like, a lot of people turn accessory dwelling units into housing that is not used in the rental market or is, used for Airbnbs, et cetera, right? So, like, it's important that we enable it as a housing type so that for those who do want to turn it into affordable housing, or attainable housing that can be used on the rental market, it can be, that can happen, but it also is not like a prescription for it. So I think the key thing is the zoning is a start, it's not the end. I will say for Minneapolis, the data has shown, yes, there are problems with the ways some of the zoning wasn't as permissive as to create, a tremendous amount of new housing, but actually, like, Minneapolis is one of the few cities that has seen both rental and for sale housing prices moderate and not have the same amount of price increase that you might see in a lot of other comparable cities. So a lot of people do attribute that to the fact that it has actually been able to catch up with demand in that area and have like a better relationship between supply and demand. And I think one of the problems that you might find in a lot of other places is like the demand for living, let's just say in San Diego, might be like way more than even you'd have to get really permissive zoning in order to meet that demand. Maybe in Minneapolis, it's a little bit more achievable. And I think that, sort of speaks to the case for a lot of these other sort of smaller cities that are trying to figure out like how can they address their affordable housing crisis. Like it may not require as much housing actually as they even think that it does. It just requires better actually meeting the demand that there is.
It's funny, as you were talking, Diana, about ADUs, you triggered in my mind, a sort of missed marketing opportunity for ADUs, which is where to put your parents while you get it on. Like, I think that might be a real
Yes.
need.
Yes.
I'll use my final question on an interesting comment you made earlier about we got to figure out how to switch the economics if we're really going to make this affordable. We have to do something innovative around the economic structure. And I'm wondering if you've seen anything or you have any thoughts on, house as tech. We're putting more and more tech into houses. That's both sensors and environmental, as well as property management, as well as fintech and payments. And of course, talking to our houses, turn the lights on or order this for me. And all these are all economic activities. There are also data gathering activities. Do you have any thoughts on house as tech and what that could do for the economics of the thing?
Mm, yeah, I mean, my thoughts on it are less on the sort of tech enabled aspects of the house so much as more of the like fintech side of things, where I'm just thinking about, people being able to either save as renters or at being able to save money towards their down payment. Like, what kind of online financial solutions would help people be able to afford their homes a bit better? Some of that kind of tech seems like sorely needed and is not as widespread. I think also people being able to figure out more like plan for their housing costs, some of those budgeting tools, things like that are sort of interesting to me. I will say, like, the other kind of tech that where it's like the tech in your house, I haven't personally embraced it. It's not something that I have, necessarily come across a ton of that. But I think that for the multifamily space, like, especially as, people try to figure out like in a communal setting, like how to better distribute amenities, parking spaces, access to shared spaces, et cetera. Some of that kind of technology that makes it like more financially possible to build multifamily where people are sharing different amenities. That could be potentially really interesting. But yeah, I haven't, I feel like, you're kind of reminding me I need to dive into this a little bit more personally.
Diana, thank you so much for taking the time. I'm so sad that we're out of time, and it's been such a great conversation. Really appreciate you joining us.
Oh, thank you so much. This has been a lot of fun.
All right, so that was Diana, the goddess of the hunt. Also, an amazing speaker. If you ever get a chance to see her at a conference or whatnot, I promise you, you will learn a ton. That's going to do it for this episode. We'd love to hear from you, so please send us an email at podcast@thehousinginsiders.com if you have any questions or whatnot. And if you like what you hear, we really appreciate when you leave us a review.
Please hit subscribe so that more of our episodes find your feed. And thank you as always to Keenan Chen for the music.